I want to ask you both, first of all, what did you make of the Home Secretary's speech? Jacqueline?
Quite disappointing, or quite disturbed by it, really, because on the one hand, I certainly agree with her, but for different reasons, that, we've probably moved on, and much of what the Refugee Convention covers probably does need looking at, but in an expansive way, not in a restrictive way. As there are a whole category of people who are fleeing persecution who aren't necessarily covered by the restrictions in the Refugee Convention. Now, they do obviously go on to get some sort of protection because, we can grant the right to remain in the UK if it's this country we're looking at specifically, under humanitarian protection rules, or even under ECHR, human rights legislation. So I think that it's restrictive and doesn't cover certain groups of people. But in terms of the Home Secretary's specific thing, and I haven't heard her entire speech, I find bits of it quite disturbing, because I've been in this space for about 40 years, in practice for about 20 of those, before that as a campaigner. And I've not yet come across somebody, either a woman from a social group or a gay person, who is fearing discrimination in their own country, but isn't at the same time experiencing real persecution, i.e. because you can't be who you want to be, you can't live your life, or the police are constantly watching you, or there are penal codes and laws. In some cases, the death penalty, penal codes in some parts of Africa, 14 years imprisonment for being a gay person. And the fact that we want to take that away, if that's what she wants to do, of course, I've not heard the fine details of her speech, but if that's the sort of thing she's proposing, I'm finding that really quite disturbing.
Okay, so you want to change things, but with the effect of opening the door wider to more potential asylum seekers.
Not necessarily wider, but looking more closely at what are the definitions. So, for instance,
but you said you want a wider range of categories.
Well, it might be that some categories aren't necessary, but we need to certainly look. I think people who say that, this convention came about to deal with a very specific issue after the Second World War are correct, but things have moved on. We've got climate justice, we've got extreme famine and poverty, where people might say, well, we can't just take on the world's poor. It's 2 billion people. But there are people who are facing, and I've seen it myself. I was in Kenya last year in the north, where I saw people who were fleeing floodplains because of climate justice, but were also facing persecution from a local militia who were taking food. So there has to be an element of persecution. We're not necessarily saying this should be unbridled or open door, or that we should take on the world's entire poor population. We've got enough of our own. About 3 million children a year are poor, based on the various economic models of how that's determined. But I do think we need to look at it. We also need to look at what are our obligations. We get very, very few people. I mean, Bangladesh has got 1 million Rohingyas. Trinidad and Tobago, that's got a population of just over 1 million people, has taken 300,000 people from Venezuela.
Okay, so we get the essence of what you're saying. We get, Jacqueline, the essence of what you're saying.
So
I want to bring in.
Need to look at.
Yeah, I honestly, I follow your point. I want to bring in Rakib Ehsan here at this moment. Rakib, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely, and it's interesting that Jacqueline raises Bangladesh's management of the Rohingya crisis on myself of Bangladeshi origin. So there needs to be a debate in terms of how do we strengthen international cooperation when it comes to rehoming refugees. I think that looking at Suella Braverman's speech in particular, the one that was delivered in Washington, D.C., she said that, if an individual is fearful of discrimination on the grounds of their sex or sexual orientation, that shouldn't be reason alone to be granted refugee status. I think that this was actually a wasted opportunity, John. I think that she could have talked about how she would look to reform the asylum system. I've previously argued for an annual cap on refugees, which is democratically determined by Parliament, but one that prioritises women and girls at serious risk of sexual violence in their homelands, in conflict affected zones, in insecure displacement facilities. And I think that talking about sexual orientation, I think in recent times, sexual orientation being part of an asylum claim, it's in the region of 1.5% or so. So I'm not sure why the Home Secretary is raising that. It represents a tiny sliver. of asylum applications. So I think here we should be talking about how do we prioritize the world's most persecuted peoples under a reformed asylum system, but we should also talk about how are refugees dispersed in the country, because the reality is, in recent times, when it comes to asylum seekers, how they're dispersed within the UK, the responsibility to rehome them has fell on the shoulders of the most deprived parts of the country. So we should talk about it being a more nationwide effort, especially when it comes to the integration of those who are granted refugee status.
Yes.
On our culture, of course, all those things happen, but we've got to address them. We are part of the world community. Our lawyers helped write the Refugee Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're the sort of country that's always taken in people who are fleeing persecution and made them feel welcome. And there is no evidence to suggest that we are going to get any larger numbers of people than we've been getting for the last 10, 20, 30 years. It's been relatively constant. There are pressures around the world. Climate justice is one of them. We're seeing all sorts of skirmishes happening again in Africa, major problems in Latin America. Of course, that's going to send people on the move. And we understand there's about 100 million people displaced around the world, a lot of them internally. And today we've heard this new figure of potentially 1 billion people, 780,000. Sorry, 780 million, I think was the figure quoted this morning. But we don't get them. But we cannot turn our back on some of them, and a relatively decent number, because we are a wealthy country. We can't just say to Bangladesh, you have them, or Colombia, you take 2 million Venezuelans. What this does need, though, I totally accept the points made by my colleague who just spoke, and forgive me for getting his name, and yourself, and what's being said by the public. There are issues, there are pressures on society. It needs a global solution, you know, whether it's the UNHCR, the UN itself needs to come together. There are some countries that get nobody. We get relatively few, but there are some countries that are really struggling with this issue.